Well, hello, good morning. We are very proud of you so early in the morning, ready to hear the keynote speaker that is my pleasure to introduce. As I just said, it's an honor for me to introduce a friend and a colleague, Dr. Ana-Maria Cheto. She studied physics at the National University of Mexico and the PhD at Harvard University. She's a researcher at the National University, and she has a very important production on fundamentals of quantum mechanics. She has held very important posts both in Mexico and abroad. She explicitly asked me not to give too many details. So I will only mention two of the prizes she has shared. The 1995 Nobel Peace Prize given to the POWASH Conferences on Science and World Affairs, and the 2005 Peace Nobel Prize given to the International Atomic Energy Agency, where she was the Deputy General Manager from 2003 to 2010. Please, Ana-Maria, welcome.
Thank you very much, Julia. Yes, we are indeed friends since a long time ago, and it has been a pleasure, and it is an honor for me now to be introduced by her. And thank you very much to the organizers, particularly, for having invited me. Thank you for being here. I think this is an exciting program, the program of this summit. I must apologize because I didn't listen to you yesterday, so this means that I may repeat some of the things that have been said, which of course would be good, no? Or maybe I will contradict others, I don't know. But I am the one who missed it, and I'm sorry for it. Well, this time, although I have been involved in actions also like the creation of the Third World Organization for Women in Science some time ago, this time my talk will not be precisely action-oriented. I thought I would share with you some critical reflections that can serve to fuel the discussions, the debate, and perhaps then give some elements that can guide the decisions on specific actions. And in this regard, and without a PowerPoint, I would like to mention the following. It is very interesting to note that in some fields and at different times in history, very specific actions have had a dramatic impact on the incorporation of women into an area of activity. There are a few successful examples of this phenomenon, not too many, unfortunately, but there are some. And I would like to refer to one of them in particular that is close to me. A recent documented study carried out in Mexico City in particular, analyzes why and how elementary school teachers became the large majority in the capital city at the beginning of last century, around the 1900s. During changing their presence from 57%, which was around 1880 or so, to 77% in a time span of only 30 years. And that means an increase of almost 40% over the 57%. That's a lot in 30 years. We would like to see that kind of change in other areas now. So how did that come about? There were two factors that were decisive for this change, according to the study that I mentioned. The first one was the opening of elementary schools to girls, which resulted in the sudden creation of a large number of extra jobs. The second factor contributing to this dramatic rise was the lack of interest of men in attending normal school. You know the term normal school, I don't know if you know it here. It was imported from Europe to Mexico. This was the time of the French influence in Mexico, within the frame of the positivist science. And that title, Normal School, reflected the intention to endow the teaching profession with a scientific character. So the normal schools were created, and they were open to many more teachers because of this because of having incorporated girls into the elementary schools. But the men were not interested in attending normal school to become teachers because although it was a professional school, it was considered actually a sort of sub-professional school, and that lasted for many years. So why take the pain to go through it? Incidentally, a similar phenomenon took place here in the US, where the lack of interest of men in elementary school teaching was due mainly to the greater job opportunities that attracted them to industry. In the case of Mexico, it was not the industry because there was almost no industry. Of course, one issue of hot debate at the time, I'm speaking of the early 1900s, was whether women would be capable of teaching science, given the inferior intellect, as many firmly believed, and not just men, also women. And this belief in those times, also prevailing among the learned people and the opinion leaders, was largely based on the works of two German, quite well-known and famous scientists. One was the prolific neurologist Möbius, of whom I'm sure you have heard. He is the author of this famous, or rather infamous, pamphlet on the physiological idiocy of women, which was published in 1900 and had 8 editions. And no less influential was the distinguished biologist Theodor Ludwig Wilhelm von Bischoff. Probably you have heard of him as well, because he's the one who argued that the inferiority of women was due to the fact that their brain weighs less than that of men. Our brain weighs less than that of men. He was not the only one, but he was famous. He was praised by his works. And another influential character of the time was the Austrian psychologist Otto Weininger, the one who in 1903 published his work where he equated genius to man. So only women who have some male character may become close to a genius, but a woman can never be a genius. Only men, when they are perfect, are geniuses. Well, not only were women not considered capable of teaching science by a sort of biological determinism, also science was considered detrimental for girls because it detracted them from becoming good housewives and mothers. There was a widespread opinion in those times, not only in those times, that women would get corrupted by science and would thus cease to play their essential role as keepers of the family sanctuary. A network of feminist scientists, teachers, not scientists, teachers, got, of course, soon organized, which fought actively not only for equal working rights and civil rights, but also for the teaching on science. And that's interesting, because, as one of them wrote, there is no scientific discipline that is impossible to be learned by girls, and none that is impossible to be taught by women teachers. Well, as you may recall, in the early 20th century, Mexico was in a real political turmoil, which developed into a revolution that shattered the country for a whole 7 years, between 1910 and 1917. Of particular relevance to my talk today is the observation made by the author of this study on how the political discourse impacted the life of people and the institutions, and the interconnection she could establish between the construction of politics by gender relations on the one hand, and the political construction of gender along with other social relations like social class and ethnicity on the other. And this brings me to the main theme of my talk and to the title which I gave to it. I don't know if you saw it somewhere in the program. The title I gave to my talk is Dialectics of Women and Science. It is true. First, I would say a word on the dialectics of gender, although much has been said about that. It is true that one of the most prevalent misconceptions in our culture still today is the idea that there exist two separate and opposite genders, masculinity and femininity. This is sometimes called the dialectic of gender. In her book, Dialectic of Sex, which is dedicated to Simone de Beauvoir, Shulamith Firestone reminds us of the Beauvoir's thesis that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one, relegating biology to the section of the second sex dedicated to the myth of destiny. My aim, however, here is not to add to this debate on the dialectics of women or gender in itself. Rather, I want to share with you my reflections on the dialectics of women and science, or women versus science. I should like to start with an assertion that has by now become an established truth, although this does not mean that it is accepted by all, namely that science is a social construct. This is in no way to diminish the merits of science, that great edifice of human intellect, but to remind us that although we have strong reasons to believe that there is one universe, one nature with a capital N, there are many different ways of looking at it. And even among scientists, there are many ways of questioning nature and finding answers. And the ways we approach nature and we understand her are deeply influenced by our cultural, educational, linguistic, social, ethnical, and gender background. This applies not just to those domains of our world covered by the social and human sciences, but also to those covered by the physical and biological sciences. On the other hand, also gender is a social construct. Simone de Beauvoir would insist that even woman is a social construct. Based on biological sex differences, society has constructed a whole range of concepts and misconcepts on the role of men and women, and has put these concepts into practice for ages. The ways we look at different sexes, we understand them, and we organize them socially are in their turn deeply influenced also by our cultural, educational, linguistic, social, ethnical, even scientific background, as became clear from the examples I quoted earlier on. Now, science and gender, these two great social constructs, have evolved along parallel paths, or one could almost say anti-parallel paths. Science without women and women without science. Well, not entirely so if one considers the historical role that women have played, up until recently at least, by supporting male scientists at home and in the lab. Save for a few exceptions of famous women scientists, which are quoted again and again, because they are exceptional, isolated cases, that has been the main role of women in relation to science, to support the work of men in the lab and at home. But the fact is that the relationship between women and science is, by construction, rather that of opposites. And this is where dialectics enters into the scene, because the resolution of opposites is not yet over. One could say, again speaking from a historical perspective, that we are still in the beginnings of the process. And that makes it, of course, the more interesting and relevant, in my view, to look into it from a dialectic perspective. Because dialectics is a method for resolving disagreement, not through rhetoric, but through rational debate and analysis, through constructive interaction, and why not sometimes deconstruction, so that at the end of the tunnel one arrives at a true solution that is built on the strengths of the opposites. This should not be a matter of winners and losers, like, for instance, if women take over in science or are taken over by it. Is that what we are witnessing today, a process of the resolution of the opposites? I venture to say that it is not, or not entirely, and I will explain myself. If one looks simply at the figures, and there are many figures now, comparative figures, per discipline, per field of activity, per institution, etc., the conclusion is that on average there has been some progress in the incorporation of women into science, slow and uneven, but some progress nevertheless. In terms of institutional changes, special programs have been created to foster women participation in science. They have been created at the level of governments, universities, schools, research institutes, and other institutions with varied success. Gender studies is now a recognized discipline in academia, which it was not some time ago, and within this discipline, the topic of women in science has received increased attention and has given rise to a range of publications. The discourse on women in science has changed noticeably. To give just one example of this, of which I was particularly aware of. In 1999, when preparing the UNESCO World Conference of Science, which was co-organized with the International Council for Science, where I was heavily involved, we managed to introduce a whole chapter of women and science in the declaration of the conference, with specific commitments from governments and scientific institutions to address the issues. This was considered a triumph in itself, especially the scientific community was not so keen on that. Yet the dominant, the Anglo-Saxon language used for the corresponding text in the declaration was, at least for some of us non-native English speakers, quite disturbing, because it systematically linked women with minorities, implying tacitly that a sector that constitutes a majority, since there are more women than men on this planet, should be considered a sort of minority. Of course, I understand that in the English language, and specifically in the social sciences, the term minority refers to a category of a group or individuals with no or little social power, and hence subject to discrimination. Interestingly, this terminology is not applied anymore to women in relation to science. It seems to have been deleted from the vocabulary somehow, even though it is true that women continue to have little social power in science. Is this social power, this so-called minority status, just a numerical issue? By no means. There is an issue with the numbers. Sociologists tell us that a group with a representation of the order of 15% or less, however active and belligerent, cannot constitute a critical mass. You need more percentage. But by just focusing on raising the numbers, it would seem that there is no contradiction between women and science, that by simply incorporating the former into the latter, both will, as of now, happily grow and live together. In other words, that the edifice historically designed and constructed by the male majority has now made some of its rooms available to be occupied by women. But by which women? Well, by those who have the merits, of course, and meet the standards. But who defines the standards? Well, of course, those who know what good science is, because they have been practicing it. But who applies those standards? Of course, the peers who know how to do their job because they have traditionally done it. They are the gatekeepers. The organizers of this summit have chosen an attractive title for it: Diversity Fueling Excellence in Research and Innovation. What is meant by excellence? Who defines it? And how is it defined? Because, and in relation to what? Because excellence is a relative term. It means the condition to surpass ordinary standards. These days, when almost everything, and particularly in science, is measured by numerical indicators, excellent performance in science means more peer-reviewed articles in more internationally indexed journals with the highest impact factors, plus more prizes and awards, plus more funded research projects, plus more participation in top committees and leadership positions, and so on, and so on. Never mind whether the science has any social relevance. Never mind that the peers are normally male. They know how to assess performance scientifically, objectively, or so it is assumed. The questioning of the gender neutrality of these established practices has been systematically seen by the mainstream community as a feminist attitude, with even a derogatory connotation, I would say, for the word feminist. I am convinced of this lack of neutrality, as many of you are, I am sure. Abundant feminist literature proves it, in fact, or aims to prove it, which I am sure you know better than I do. So in order to avoid being repetitive, I will refer to a couple of independent studies that are not gender-related that provide evidence to support my conviction. And yet they obviously have no feminist background at all because they come from different arenas. The first one is an analysis that was carried out by the NIH, the National Institutes of Health here, on race, ethnicity, and research awards. This was reported in Science magazine in 2011. I'm not referring to the study, the famous study by Veneros and Wald from '97, which was carried out in Sweden, no? Which was gender-related. The one I'm referring to, the science study, was not gender-related. Medicine, in the field of medicine, it is recognized that bias can occur, and all too often it occurs at any phase of research, from study design, data collection to publication. But this one was a comparative study on successful grant applications. And it revealed that even though the peer review system supposedly ranks applications based just on scientific merit, being blind about gender, race, ethnicity, etc., the system clearly favors whites over other ethnic groups by a considerable percentage, with a disadvantage of more than 13% in the case of African Americans, for instance. This evidence goes against the NIH's declared intention and historical efforts, one should say, to increase diversity among its ranks through targeted programs. Even the head of the NIH was surprised by these findings. How can such a gap be explained when the applicants were supposed to enter all on an equal footing? The authors of the study point to a gradual cumulative effect of small differences of advantage or disadvantage in access to previous training, mentoring, resources, and other benefits. These are the what Allen and Madden call the micro inequities, which accumulate. Some of them, I would say, are not so micro, especially if you include also personal contacts, socioeconomic status, etc. As a consequence, those members of the minority groups, the so-called minority groups that make it into academia and supposedly meet the same performance standards as their fellow white colleagues, continue to suffer from hidden factors of discrimination that reduce their chances of success. Another piece of critical evidence is a whole series of recent analyses that are not gender-related and that point to unavoidable bias in the peer review system used by scientific journals. This system, we are often told, was designed to assure the validity and quality of science that seeks publication. Now it is increasingly recognized, however, that peer review is an imperfect process, beset with flaws that virtually invalidate its efficacy and put it seriously into question. The conclusion of a recent documented study on the subject is that peers, those scientists supposedly knowledgeable and close to the subject matter, who act as the gatekeepers of science, are the least appropriate judges of a paper because of a combination of factors that either openly or inadvertently prevent them from making objective assessment. Among these factors, some are quite evident and simple: the language of the paper, the country of origin of the author, his institution or her, the familiarity of the reviewer with the topic, his conflicts of interest with regard to credit for the work or financial benefits, differences of opinion about the subject, etc. But then there are more subtle biases that are difficult to disclose and even more difficult to eradicate. Some are, more often than not, denied or even ignored. and that doesn't help. So coming back to the subject of this summit and of my talk, there are clear indications that the current established scientific system contains intrinsic structural elements that work against diversity of different kinds. Diversity of gender is one of the victims of this system, perhaps the most recognized one today, but it is not the only one. If we want to have a significant presence as women in research and innovation, we need to be able to contribute to a change in the structural elements of the great scientific edifice, instead of just coming as intruders to fill the rooms made available to us. This means contributing to a change in science as an institution. To achieve this change, we need to openly and critically take part in defining what is science, what is important in science, and how is it assessed, in revising the standards and the rules of the game, in setting up scientific institutions, networks, organizations, labs, and other such groups, in establishing new priorities, in questioning the stereotypes, in finding new ways of teaching and of doing science. To the extent that we manage to play this role, which is at the same time a subversive and a constructive one, science will become more naturally open and receptive to the full participation of women as women, rather than as followers or supporters of men, and the historical disagreement between women and science will be dialectically resolved. But even more important, and this is to finish my talk, in my view, is that to the extent that we succeed in this important endeavor, science will become more aware of the benefits of diversity and more sensitive to the need to respond to other groups that have been traditionally left out, even more left out than women, by multiple forms of overt or covert discrimination, including, I think importantly, the holders of the valuable traditional knowledge that still exists in our countries and which is being swept out or washed away by modernity. And in my view, this will make the results of our efforts the more valuable. Thank you very much.